My mother died when I was 16 years old, and I learned very quickly that grief is not a gentle teacher. It does not prepare you. It does not ease you into loss. It simply takes and takes until you are hollow. Cancer, the doctors said, and those 6 months from diagnosis to funeral felt like being dragged behind a moving car. Every day was a new horror, watching the woman who had been my entire world shrink and fade, her skin turning gray, her voice becoming a whisper, her hands that had once held mine so tightly growing weak and cold. I remember sitting in the hospital room during those final weeks, the steady beep of machines counting down the moments we had left, and I remember my father sitting in the corner, his face blank, his eyes distant, as if he had already started to leave the room even while she was still breathing. I did not understand it then, that distant look, but I would come to understand it later. I would come to understand that my father had always been a man who moved on quickly, a man who could not bear to sit in emptiness for long, a man who needed someone to fill the spaces that loss carved out of his life. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and murmured sympathies, relatives I barely recognized patting my shoulder and telling me that my mother had been a wonderful woman, as if I needed them to tell me that, as if I had not known her better than anyone in that room. My father stood beside me through it all, playing the role of the grieving widower. But even then, even in those first weeks, I could see his eyes wandering, could see him looking for something or someone to ease his loneliness. I did not blame him, not then. I told myself that everyone grieves differently, that his distance was his way of coping, that he would come back to me when the pain became more manageable. I was wrong. 1 year later, almost to the day, my father sat me down in the living room of the house my grandparents had built, the house where my mother had grown up, the house that held every memory I had of her, and he told me he was getting remarried. I stared at him, trying to process his words, trying to reconcile the man sitting in front of me with the man who had stood at my mother's grave just 12 months earlier, promising to honor her memory forever. "Her name is Tracy," he said, "and she's wonderful, and she has 2 children, and she makes me happy again." His words washed over me like cold water, and I felt something inside me harden, a wall going up between us that I did not even know I was building. I wanted to scream at him, wanted to ask him how he could move on so quickly, how he could bring another woman into the home where my mother had lived and died, but I said nothing. I learned early that my father did not handle confrontation well, that he would simply shut down or walk away. And so I swallowed my anger and I nodded, and I told him that I was happy for him, even as something inside me broke a little more. Tracy seemed nice at first, in the way that people who are trying very hard to make a good impression always seem nice. She smiled too much, laughed too loudly at my father's jokes, and asked me questions about school and friends and my plans for the future with the forced enthusiasm of a job interviewer. I could see what she was doing, could see the performance beneath the warmth, but I played along because I did not have the energy for conflict, and because a small, desperate part of me hoped that maybe she really would be the kind of stepmother who cared, the kind who might ease some of the loneliness I felt every day. But Tracy was not interested in being a mother to me. Tracy was interested in my father's stability, in his income, in the beautiful house he lived in, and most of all, in what being married to him could provide for her own children. I realized this gradually, in small moments that added up to a picture I could not ignore. The way she looked at the house, running her fingers along the wooden banister my grandfather had carved, examining the antique fixtures, calculating the value of everything she saw. The way she positioned herself in family photos, always at the center, always in front, as if she had always belonged there and the rest of us were just background. The way she spoke about her children, Derek who was 19 and Ashley who was 17, always in terms of what they deserved, what they needed, what they should have. Derek and Ashley moved into our house 3 weeks after the wedding, and I watched my home transform into something unrecognizable. They were not bad people, not in the way that villains in stories are bad, but they were selfish and entitled in the way that people who have never been told no are always selfish and entitled. They treated the house like a hotel, leaving dishes in the sink, towels on the bathroom floor, taking up space on the couch, and at the table as if they had always been there. Derek spent his days playing video games in what had been my mother's study, the room where she had graded papers and written lesson plans, and where I had sometimes sat with her after school, talking about my day. I asked him once, politely, if he could maybe use a different room, if I could maybe keep that space as it was, and he looked at me like I was crazy and said that it was the best room in the house for his setup, and that I was being dramatic about a room that nobody was using anyway. Ashley was no better. She took over the guest bathroom, filling it with her makeup and hair products, leaving the counter cluttered and the mirror always smudged with fingerprints. She borrowed my clothes without asking, returned them stretched or stained, and when I confronted her, she rolled her eyes and called me possessive. These were small things, minor intrusions that might seem insignificant on their own, but they added up, day after day, week after week, until I felt like a stranger in the only home I had ever known. The hardest part was watching my father change. He had always been a somewhat passive man, content to let my mother handle the difficult conversations, the discipline, the emotional labor of running a family, and after she died, he seemed to be looking for someone else to take over that role. Tracy stepped into that vacuum with alarming speed, and within months, she was making decisions about the house, about meals, about schedules, about everything, and my father simply went along with it. I tried to talk to him a few times, tried to tell him how I was feeling, tried to explain that Tracy and her children were taking over, but he would listen with that distant look in his eyes and then say something about giving them time to adjust, about being patient, about how we were all family now. Family. The word felt like a lie every time he said it. For 2 years, I lived like a ghost in my own home, moving through rooms that no longer felt like mine. Eating meals at a table where I was increasingly treated like a burden rather than a daughter. Tracy's smile became thinner, her tone sharper, and the questions about school and friends that had once been annoyingly enthusiastic stopped entirely. I was no longer worth the effort of even pretend interest. I was simply there, an inconvenience, a reminder of my father's previous life, an obstacle to the new family she was trying to build. I threw myself into school and my part-time job at a coffee shop downtown, staying late after classes, picking up extra shifts, finding any excuse to be out of the house and away from the tension that had become as constant as the air I breathed. I was tired all the time, exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix, and I could feel myself becoming smaller, quieter, fading into the background of my own life. I thought about my mother every day, thought about what she would say if she could see what had happened to our home, to our family, to me. I imagined her walking through the front door, taking in the mess and the noise and the strangers who had taken over her space, and I imagined her fighting for me, protecting me, reminding my father of what we had lost and what he was allowing to be destroyed. But my mother was gone, and I was alone. What Tracy did not know, what my father did not know, what no one knew except my grandparents' lawyer, was that the house had never belonged to my father at all. My grandparents had built this house decades before I was born, had raised my mother here, had watched her leave and return and leave again, and when they died within 6 months of each other when I was 12, they had left behind careful instructions for what should happen to their legacy. My grandfather had been a lawyer himself, a man who understood families and money and the conflicts that arise when the two intersect, and he had set up a trust that would transfer ownership of the house to me on my 18th birthday. My parents had lived here, had maintained it, had paid the property taxes and the insurance, but they had always known that it would pass to me eventually, that I was the intended heir, that this house was my inheritance. What my father had apparently forgotten, or chosen to ignore, was that his right to live here had always been contingent on my grandmother's wishes, and those wishes had been very clear. The house was to be mine. The house was always meant to be mine. And when I turned 18, 3 weeks before Tracy sat me down to demand rent, the trust had activated, the deed had transferred, and I had become the legal owner of the property that Tracy had been treating as her own personal kingdom. I had not told anyone about the trust, had not told my father or Tracy or anyone at school that on my 18th birthday, I had become a homeowner. Mr. Brennan, my grandparents' lawyer, had explained everything to me in his quiet office with its leather chairs and shelves of law books, had shown me the documents and the deed and the letter my grandmother had written to be given to me when I turned 18. I had read that letter 100 times since then, holding it like a talisman, drawing strength from my grandmother's words about family and legacy, and standing up for yourself when the world tries to take what is yours. She had written it knowing that my grandfather's trust might one day be important, knowing that families change and relationships shift, and that inheritance can be a complicated thing. She had wanted me to be prepared, to understand that this house was more than just a building, that it was a connection to my mother, to my history, to who I was before everything fell apart. I had not been ready to tell my father, had not been ready for the confrontation I knew would come, had not been ready to exercise rights that felt too big for an 18-year-old girl who was still trying to figure out who she was. And then Tracy demanded $800 a month in rent, and I knew that the time for waiting was over. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening, after I had come home from a double shift at the coffee shop, my feet aching and my mind foggy with exhaustion. My father called me into the living room, and I knew from his tone that something was wrong, that this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. Tracy was there too, sitting on the couch with her arms crossed, wearing an expression of barely contained impatience, as if I was wasting her time by simply existing. My father asked me to sit down, and I did, perching on the edge of the armchair across from them, and then he cleared his throat and said that Tracy thought it was time I started contributing to household expenses. I asked what he meant, even though I already knew, even though I could see where this was going, and he said rent. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and absurd, and I repeated it back to him like a question, rent, as if maybe I had misheard, as if maybe my father was not actually asking me to pay to live in my own home. He nodded, not meeting my eyes, and said that Tracy thought it was fair, that I was an adult now, that I should pay my way like everyone else. I stared at him, this man who I had loved and resented and pitied and forgiven 100 times over the past 2 years, and I felt something shift inside me, something settling into place like a lock clicking open. I asked him how much, already knowing from Tracy's satisfied smile that it would be more than I could afford, and when he said $800 a month, I actually laughed. It was not a funny laugh. It was a sound of disbelief, of outrage, of a 16-year-old girl inside me screaming at the injustice of what was being asked. I told him I worked part-time at a coffee shop, that I made maybe $1,000 a month if I picked up extra shifts, that they were asking me to give them 80% of my income. My father looked uncomfortable, but Tracy did not flinch, did not waver, just watched me with those calculating eyes, and I understood then that this had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with pushing me out, making me so uncomfortable, so broke, so desperate that I would leave on my own. I asked about Derek and Ashley, who were older than me, who did not go to school, who sat around the house all day contributing nothing, and my father said that was not the point, that the point was everyone contributing, that Tracy managed the finances, and this was what she thought was fair. I wanted to scream at him then, wanted to tell him that nothing about this was fair, that Tracy was not managing finances. She was manipulating him, that Derek and Ashley did not contribute anything and never had, that they were parasites living off my family's generosity while I was being treated like a burden. I wanted to tell him that the house was not his to charge rent for, that my grandparents had left it to me. That I could have him evicted if I wanted to, that Tracy and her children had no right to be here at all. But I did not say any of that. Instead, I took a breath. I looked at my father's face, and I saw the weakness there, the unwillingness to stand up to his new wife, the path of least resistance he had chosen again and again over the past 2 years. And in that moment, I made a decision. I told him I would think about it, and Tracy smiled again, that thin, satisfied smile, and my father nodded and said not to think too long because Tracy wanted the first payment by the end of the week. I walked out of that living room, up the stairs to my bedroom, and I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as if I could shut out everything that had just happened. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding, and I felt tears pricking at my eyes, tears of anger and frustration and grief for the father I had lost, and the mother who was gone, and the home that had been stolen from me piece by piece. But then I thought about the letter in my drawer, my grandmother's handwriting flowing across the page, telling me to be strong, to stand up for myself, to remember that this house was mine and no one could take it from me unless I let them. And I stopped crying. I straightened up. I walked to my desk. I pulled out the letter and the business card for Mr. Brennan, and I made a phone call that would change everything. Mr. Brennan answered on the third ring, his voice calm and professional, and when I told him what was happening, he listened without interrupting, asked a few clarifying questions, and then said that it was time. Time for what, I asked, even though I already knew. Time to tell them, he said. Time to exercise my rights. Time to remind everyone exactly whose house this was. He explained what would happen next, the legal process, the documents that would need to be served, the timeline for eviction if I chose that route. And I felt a thrill run through me at that word. Eviction, at the idea that I could do to Tracy what she was trying to do to me, that I could push her out of my home, that I could take back what was mine. Mr. Brennan asked me if I wanted them to leave, all of them, Tracy and Derek and Ashley, and I thought about the past 2 years, the way I had been pushed aside, dismissed, treated like an intruder in my own home. I thought about my father who had let it happen, who had chosen Tracy over me again and again. And I said yes. I wanted them to leave. 3 days later, I sat across from Mr. Brennan in his office, signing documents that would change the shape of my family forever. There was a letter formally notifying Tracy, Derek, and Ashley that they were living in my house without my permission, an eviction notice giving them 60 days to vacate, and a separate document explaining that my father could stay if he chose, that I would not evict him, that he was still my family despite everything. Mr. Brennan asked if I was sure about that last part, if I wanted to give my father the choice, and I said yes. I was angry at him, had been angry at him for 2 years, but he was still my father, and somewhere beneath the weakness and the betrayal, I still loved him. I wanted him to have the chance to choose me, to stand by me, to be the father I remembered from before my mother died. I did not know if he would, but I wanted to give him the option. The next evening, I sat at the dinner table, watching Tracy take her place at the head, the seat where my mother used to sit, and I felt the weight of the envelope in my lap, the papers inside that would shatter the illusion Tracy had built around herself. Derek and Ashley were already eating, plates piled high with food Tracy had prepared, and my father sat across from me, not meeting my eyes, still uncomfortable from our conversation 3 days earlier. Tracy asked me if I had thought about what we discussed, her tone condescending, as if she was talking to a child who had misbehaved, and I said yes. I had thought about it, and I had something to say. The room went quiet as I stood up, all eyes on me, and I pulled the envelope from my lap, sliding the papers across the table until they rested in front of Tracy. She looked down at them, irritation flickering across her face, and asked what this was. I told her to read it, my voice steady, my hands no longer shaking, and she picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the first page. I watched her face as she read, watched the confusion give way to disbelief, the disbelief to anger, the anger to something that looked almost like fear. She looked up at me and said that this could not be right, that these papers said I owned the house. And I said yes, that was correct. The house was mine, had been mine for 3 weeks, would always be mine. She turned to my father, demanding an explanation, and he looked at me with something I had not seen in a long time. He looked at me with respect, with surprise, with the beginning of understanding. The conversation that followed was everything I had imagined and nothing I had expected. Tracy raged and denied and accused me of lying, of forging documents, of trying to destroy this family. Derek and Ashley sat frozen, their forks halfway to their mouths, as they realized that the comfortable life their mother had promised them was built on a foundation that had just crumbled to dust. And my father, my weak, conflict-averse father, sat silently, reading and rereading the papers, his face cycling through emotions I could not quite identify. When Tracy demanded that he do something, that he fight for her, that he defend his wife against his ungrateful daughter, he looked up at her and said quietly that the papers were real, that his parents had left the house to my mother, that my mother had been their only child, that of course they would have wanted it to pass to me. Tracy stared at him, and I saw in that moment the calculation behind her eyes, the frantic attempt to find a way out, a loophole, a way to hold on to the life she had built on someone else's property. She tried to argue that she had rights, that she had lived here for 2 years, that she had improved the house, that she was his wife and wives had rights to marital property. And I let her talk, Let her dig her hole deeper, before I quietly mentioned that Mr. Brennan had already explained all of this to me, that the house was not marital property because it was inherited, that her improvements had been made without my permission, that she had no legal standing whatsoever. The 60 days that followed were some of the strangest and most painful of my life. Tracy, Derek, and Ashley moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding me, avoiding my father, packing boxes in the spare rooms and making plans for somewhere else to live. Tracy tried to fight the eviction, hired a lawyer with money I did not know she had, and Mr. Brennan handled everything, calling me with updates, assuring me that her case had no merit, that the court would dismiss it, that I just needed to be patient. The court date came and went, and the judge dismissed Tracy's suit in less than 15 minutes, looking almost annoyed that such a ridiculous case had been brought before him at all. Tracy did not say goodbye when she left, just loaded the last box into a moving truck and drove away without looking back. Derek and Ashley followed separately, moving in with their biological father, a man Tracy had spoken about with nothing but contempt, but who was apparently willing to take them in when they had nowhere else to go. And my father stayed. We had a long conversation the night after Tracy left, sitting in the living room that had once been my mother's, that had been invaded and changed and made strange by Tracy's presence. He asked me why I had not told him about the house, and I told him the truth, that I had not known how, that I had been afraid he would take Tracy's side, that I had needed to be sure before I said anything. He flinched at that, at the acknowledgement that I had not trusted him to protect me, and he apologized, not the quick, dismissive apologies he had offered over the past 2 years when I tried to talk to him about Tracy, but a real apology, one that acknowledged his failures and took responsibility for his mistakes. He told me he had been so lost after my mother died, so desperate to fill the emptiness, that he had let Tracy take over because it was easier than facing his grief, that he had ignored my unhappiness because acknowledging it would mean admitting that he had failed me, that he was sorry, so sorry, for not being the father I needed. I listened, and I cried, and he cried, and we sat together in the house that had witnessed every moment of our family's history, the good and the bad, and I told him that I forgave him. Not because he deserved it immediately, not because everything was suddenly okay, but because I wanted to, because he was my father, because I needed him in my life, and because I believed that people could change, could learn from their mistakes, could become better if given the chance. It has been a year since that night, since the eviction, since Tracy drove away and took her entitled children, and her calculating smile, and her pretend affection with her. My father lives in the guest house out back now, a small apartment above the garage that my grandparents had built for visiting family, and we have dinner together once a week, talking and rebuilding our relationship, learning how to be father and daughter again after 2 years of being strangers. He is different now, more present, more attentive, more willing to have difficult conversations instead of shutting down or walking away. He dated briefly, a woman he met through work, but it did not last, and he told me recently that he is in no rush to find someone else, that he is learning to be comfortable on his own, that he wants to focus on repairing his relationship with me before he thinks about adding anyone else to the equation. Tracy calls him sometimes, I know this because he tells me, always asking to come back, always claiming she has changed, always saying she made a mistake and she loves him and they should try again. He says no. Every time he says no. House feels different now, feels like mine in a way it never did when Tracy was here, filling every room with her presence, her things, her demands. I have redecorated slowly, carefully, removing the traces of Tracy's 2-year occupation and replacing them with things that feel like me, like my mother, like the family I came from. I framed my grandmother's letter and hung it in my bedroom where I can see it every morning when I wake up, a reminder of where I came from and what I have overcome. I graduated high school last spring, and I am taking classes at the local community college now, working toward a degree in business, learning about finance and management and all the things Tracy pretended to understand but never really did. I still work at the coffee shop, not because I need the money, but because I like the routine, the regular customers, the feeling of earning something for myself. I am 19 years old, and I own a house, and I have a relationship with my father that is slowly healing, and I have a future that feels open and full of possibility. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I am lying in bed thinking about everything that happened, I wonder what my life would be like if I had just paid the rent. If I had given Tracy $800 a month, if I had kept my head down and my mouth shut and let her continue to take and take and take. I would be broke, for one thing, working every possible shift just to hand over most of my earnings to a woman who had no right to ask for them. I would be resentful, bitter, watching Derek and Ashley contribute nothing while I paid for the privilege of living in my own home. I would be silent, small, fading further into the background until I disappeared entirely. And Tracy would have won. She would have gotten everything she wanted: the house, the stability, the life my father could provide, without having to earn any of it, without having to care about the people who were already here when she arrived. She would have pushed me out, slowly but surely, until I was gone and she could pretend that she and her children were the only family that mattered. But I did not pay the rent. I stood up, I spoke out, I fought back, and I won. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to hurt Tracy or destroy my father's marriage, but because I deserved respect in my own home from the people who were supposed to care about me. I was not harsh. I was not cruel. I was not the villain of this story. I was a girl who had lost her mother and watched her father move on too fast and endured 2 years of being treated like an intruder in the only home she had ever known. I was a granddaughter honoring the legacy her grandparents had left her. I was an 18-year-old who learned that sometimes you have to fight for the things that should have been given to you freely, and that there is nothing wrong with demanding what is rightfully yours. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been made to feel like a stranger in your own home? Have you ever watched someone take what belongs to you and try to convince you that it was never really yours? Have you ever had to fight for respect from the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally? Tell me your stories in the comments below, and let me know if you think I did the right thing or if you think I was too harsh. And if this story resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding along or clenching your fists, or feeling that surge of satisfaction when Tracy finally got what she deserved, then hit that like button. Subscribe to Sleep Revenge for more stories like this. And I will see you in the next one.